Hello, I have a rant. If you play D&D, chances are at some point you've heard of Critical Role. And let me just be very clear, I don't like it very much. There's a couple reasons for it. Here's all of them. So the first reason is that I think it's done a lot to skew the idea of what D&D is. People look at Critical Role and they go, that's what D&D is. I want to play D&D because I want to do that because they're interested in the character interaction roleplay stuff. And that's all fine. It's not like D&D doesn't let you do that. The thing that you have to remember, though, is that that's all stuff that gets heaped on top of D&D. Like, that's not part of the game. If you look at the systems and the mechanics of D&D, like you read the PHP and you read the DMG and even the supplemental material, that is a tabletop war game. That is a tactical war game. There's nothing else in there except like ability checks, basically. So you're either making an ability check, you're in combat, or you're doing some other thing that has nothing to do with the actual mechanics of the game. That's just the reality of D&D. So my thing is like not, hey, if you are into storytelling, stop it. No, it would more just be like, I would recommend other game systems, right? Like Call of Cthulhu is a really well-built roleplay sort of game where there's like a lot of stuff where it's all about looking into stuff and investigating. You know, you're an investigator. The setting is different, but it's all about you sort of like finding out what's going on. And if you get into a fight in Call of Cthulhu, like you're in bad shape already. You have already gone down a bad path. So if you really think of things in terms of like, oh, combat versus role play, and I want that, you know, that 60-40 RP split that everybody always talks about. No, none of that, because combat and role play are not mutually exclusive at all. And I think being a good DM basically comes down to, can you bring combat and roleplay into concert with one another? Can you bring them into harmony? Because if you can't, D&D is not the game for you. It's not the game you should be running, and it's not the game your players, if they're interested in roleplay, should be playing. If you think of combat as like a thing that you have to do and then kind of get out of the way because it's like a bit of a sort of a necessity, like you're doing perfunctory combat, stop playing Dungeons and Dragons. Play look, I'm not trying to tell you what to do, so maybe don't stop playing Dungeons and Dragons, but consider other role-playing systems, because there are much better ones out there. Vampire Masquerade is another one that's really good at that. Like, don't just stick to D&D because Critical Role does it. Like, no, it's totally stupid. That's the other thing that I don't like about Critical Role, by the way, is the fact that it creates an expectation not of high caliber play that nobody else can live up to, because as far as I'm concerned, I'm at least as good of a DM as Matt Mercer is. No, that's not the problem. The problem is people expect you to specifically bring characters to life through a really good understanding of voice work, which I don't have because I'm not a voice actor. I'm a game designer. So what I do is I build crazy systems. Like everyone has custom classes all the time. Not everyone, but very, very frequently people have custom classes, custom subclasses that really help bring their characters to life through the decisions that they have to make through those classes and through the subclasses and what that creates. And that, to me, is so much more interesting, and it creates a lot of really interesting roleplay opportunities that aren't about what does your character say, how does your character feel, and it's more about what kinds of decisions are your character making. And that the idea of that your character is making decisions, that's what roleplay is. What your character would do in making decisions in terms of what that character's headspace is like and what their goals are. That's what role-playing is. It doesn't have to be voices. And this idea of like Critical Role being this whole big thing is kind of, I would definitely never go so far as to say it ruins D&D. That would be ridiculous. But it does have some detrimental effects. The way people look at it and perceive it and try to apply what they see in D&D does cause some problems. Now, I'm not heaping that responsibility on Critical Role as a show specifically. That would also be unfair. It's more about how people perceive it. There's a lot that people should do if they're like watching Critical Role and want to get into D&D and they've never done it before. And the number one thing that you should do is understand that D&D is a game about fighting things. That's the whole game. Like, if you take out all of the combat directly related to combat mechanics and systems, there's like nothing left. It's like, well, you can make a perception check. You can make a you can maybe make a persuasion check. But honestly, even ability scores, a lot of them are like, why would you want to make a perception check? To make sure that there's nothing around us that's going to kill us. And if there is, combat. And if there's not, you're relieved by that. Why? Because combat features so prominently. If combat didn't feature prominently, you wouldn't be worried about things finding you. Like, the game is all about murder. It's all about murder. People are always so confused why their players are murder hobos. It's because they're playing a murder game. It's actually really easy to accidentally create murder hobos because the game is murder. Okay, so like, here's a great example. If your players, and I talked a little bit about this in the one video that it was not very well explained, but like there's this idea where if your players are in a situation and it's like, oh man, the town is like under attack by this thing, and you go to fight the thing, and the other guy, there's like a guy attacking the town, and you go try to fight the guy, and the guy goes, no. I'm attacking the town because the town attacked me, and the DM's like, I'm so clever, I'm giving you like moral gray, okay. And then you talk to the guy, and he's like, no. I'm attacking the town because they attacked me. I gotta get rid of them because otherwise they're gonna kill my town. So I gotta save my town, and yeah, I gotta kill this town to do that. That's unfortunate, but too bad. And then you gotta fight the guy, and then you're fighting the guy, and then you're like, okay, maybe we can resolve this peacefully, right? If your players go, maybe we should resolve this peacefully, and then you give them no avenue to do that, you just started the path of creating murder hobos. Because if you do that and there's no path to like solve that peacefully, so your players just kind of get forced to kill them, you as a DM might be thinking, no, I'm gonna make it all dramatic and sad because you're gonna kill the guy and because you had no choice. But there's a fine line between incredible nonsense and the unjust tragedy the way that story could become. But if you just kind of constantly force your players into these situations where they're like, I'm gonna be non-lethal, and then you're like, no, and eventually they're gonna stop being non-lethal. Like, they're just gonna start waltzing and murdering everything, because the whole, if you remove other elements, all that they have left is the elements that are in the game proper, that are in the foundation of the game rules, which is, here's how you murder things. Well, that's the tool that we have. And when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And all players have the tool of murder, because D&D is all about murder. So you can absolutely just accidentally create murder hobos. And I've seen this happen so many times. People complaining about, my players are all murder hobos, but they do nothing to like keep them from becoming murder hobos in the first place, and then nothing to deter it later. Like, I have never had a murder hobo problem. It's never been a thing. It's never been a thing. Because if my players go for non-lethal solutions, I just kind of tend to try to give them some. And you know, you can create interesting tensions, but you have to be very careful about creating meta tensions that don't make any sense, right? So if you have a player who's like, I'm a pacifist, like if you have, let's say you have a pacifist player, and again, I gave this example in that video, but I'm going to do it again. So if you have this pacifist and then you give him a fight and you go, there's no pacifistic options, there's no non-lethal options. Now what you have is, what you have in the immediate sense might be, okay, well, now the player has to come to terms with this problem, but that's not necessarily the tension you've created, because you've relinquished control over your design by not figuring out what that means and how that's defined through player decisions and how do you lead up to it and what context you need to do for it. And if you do that a few times, then long term, that tension becomes, I can't ever do non-lethal things, so should I bother keeping this non-lethal character trait, or what? Like, and if your tension is keep the non-lethal character trait or don't, like, keep the non-lethal character trait, but it causes your party all kinds of logistical problems and it makes you as a character and a player a huge inconvenience for your party, that's not a tension you want to create, because the player is just going to be like, well, I don't want to be a burden, so I guess I'll just stop being non-lethal. And there you go. You're like, there's no more story, right? You're now like undermining your own narrative elements through bad gameplay decisions, through bad gameplay design decisions, by not understanding what the nature of your tension is. So anyway, Critical Role makes people think that it's all about story, and that's a problem, because then people look at like the music choice, the voice that you do, the accents that you can do, and it's like, I have all these voices and accents, because players look at superficial elements. They look at superficial elements and they attach themselves to those. They latch onto those and they go, that's the thing, because that's the only thing that they see. From their perspective, it's all that there is. So if that's all that there is from their perspective, then now you're like, well, as a designer, if that's all there is from the player's perspective, and you're thinking like a player instead of like a designer, then you're going to look at that and go, that's what we need more of. We need more of that, more cool music, cool voices. And you're going to spend all your time trying to figure out, how to do a New Zealand accent to make your new NPC sound different, and then you're gonna create a meta tension that ruins everybody's everything. So you got to be careful. You got to be thinking about it like everything. And when you're learning the game from Critical Role, you don't get any of that stuff, because Matt Mercer is not a good designer. He is not a good designer. I've looked pretty extensively into the Bloodhunter class, his also his Gunslinger class that he ported from the Pathfinder build. In the first season of their show. I've also looked like the monk subclass that he did. They're terrible. Like, they're dumb subclasses. I generally recommend people don't use them. In fact, one time I had a player who was like, I'm thinking about playing a Blood Hunter. And I was like, nope, don't play it. No. And and I just made a completely different thing that was just like, I'm going to take the concept and just do a much better job with it. Because I'm a game designer and he's a voice actor, and I'm about as good at voices as he is at game design. So, that seems fair. But I get bothered by it, because it's so frustrating, because game design is like it's not a really well respected or well understood field, and everything we do with it is basically just trying to figure out principles, trying to nail this thing down. We don't really know what it is yet. It's still very new. If we look at like film criticism or literary criticism, those things are miles ahead of game design critique, because those have been around forever. I mean, especially writing. Literature has been around for literally millennia, right? All the way back to the earliest like Greek plays and stuff. I don't know the history of literature very well, but maybe further? I don't know. Look, the point is, you got to be careful. I don't have a point. I have a lot of points and no points. It's a whole just rant. Look, the thing is, Critical Role bothers me because people look at that and they don't see these elements. They don't see the more complex elements, and they don't see the weird connections that get made in the designs. They don't care. And part of it is that a lot of people still think about, when they look at a class, they're looking for, does the class have abilities that let me do the thing I want to do? Like, it's an aesthetic decision, right? And people aren't equipped to make design decisions. They're only equipped to make aesthetic decisions. So they do things like things like just a common class archetype that people want tends to rise to popularity, regardless of whether or not it's particularly well made. It just has to be reasonably competent and scratch that itch that people want. But if you design something really, really interesting, that's like a really unique design concept, even if it's well executed, it doesn't necessarily catch on, because people just don't see that. They don't see the merit of that, because nobody knows design. Like, people don't know design. And it means that as a designer, you have your work cut out for you. And a lot of people are going to tell you, like, make sure that the presentation content is solid. And you should, because that's the thing that players are going to immediately attach to. But it can be frustrating, because you can put a lot of time and effort into a really, really well-built mechanic or a really, really well-made system. And then it just doesn't matter because it's not pretty enough. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but it is kind of the idea. Anyway, oh man, that was it. I had apparently like 2 or 3 things that I wanted to rant about, so I just did. I expect this to get like I don't know. Look, here's the thing, okay? If you're doing combat design, let's bring this back to D&D. If you're doing combat design, you need to define the reason. One of the main reasons you need to define the player experience is that you can't let it get away from you. Oh God, that's another thing people do is they get positive feedback from their players and then they go, I did a good job today. It's like, your players don't know how to assess design and you don't know how to assess design. Not you personally, wonderful viewer, but if somebody like doesn't know how to assess design and their players don't, it's like I don't, you should be careful. You should be very wary of positive feedback because you get positive feedback for weird things that don't matter. Like, do you know how often I get feedback for like my music choices and having like really nice clean music cues? Like I don't care. I'm actually decent with the music management in my game, but like I don't, it doesn't matter, right? It's not something that I put a ton of thought into. It's like the last thing that I do if I have time and feel like it. The most important thing is to nail the encounter. And I mean the encounter. It doesn't even have to be the encounter of that session. It just has to be the encounter that you're either coming off of or leading up to, even if there's no combat in the session that you're in. It's all defined by leading up to and coming off of encounters. That's everything. That's everything. Because it's Dungeons and Dragons. Why do you think like almost every campaign has a BBEG that you end up fighting? Because it's all there is to do. You want to go shopping? Cool. You can turn that into like a role play element, but at the end of the day, the reason you're going shopping is to get stuff to murder things with. Sometimes people like to shop for aesthetic purposes. Absolutely. That is a thing. But again, that's not really a part of D&D. I mean, it kind of is in the fact that you can spend gold on items, but that really just comes down to like a player describes a thing and then you say yes or no and you maybe make adjustments and they buy it. But what's the tension there? Well, they spend money. Why is that a problem? Well, because they need money to buy stuff so that they don't die, right? If you need to upgrade your equipment, maybe you have magic shops in your game and people can buy magic items. Like, I run a really low gold game. My players get 400 gold each and they're ecstatic because that's more money than they've ever seen. They usually are sitting like around 100 or many of them less on a regular basis. So I have magic item shops in my game, but it's very out of their price range. I like to do that for a lot of reasons, but the main reason is that it helps to maintain that tension of like, what do you buy? So that when I do give you a good sum of gold, it's, you can go buy one spell scroll, or you can save up for something big like plate mail, or you can, spend it on little aesthetic things. And that way you can absolutely buy aesthetic things, but it's not, right? It's a choice you make, and there's a detriment to it. And if it's aesthetic stuff that you want most, but you're deciding not to get aesthetic stuff because you want stuff to make you more effective in combat, maybe it's even just healing potions or something, that's fine, because now when I give you a lot of money, it's the reward isn't gold. That's the nice thing about gold as a reward, is that it's when you give your party gold, it's a different reward for everyone in that party. Everyone is getting a different reward out of that as a result of getting the gold, because nobody thinks, oh yay, we have gold, end of thought. Everyone thinks, we have gold, now I can do X. But everyone's X is a little bit different. So some people might do aesthetic stuff, some people might do combat stuff. That's all fine. Maybe even potions, right? Stuff like that. Or bribing guards, helping out NPCs, right? Like, whatever you want to do, gold is really nice. But how do you get gold? Well, you could set up a system where, like, people say things like, I'm going to start a bakery. I'm going to run a restaurant in D&D. You can do that technically, but you can't really also, because running a restaurant isn't really, there's no system to support that. You could do that, but there is no core system to support that, because it would be meaningless to build that, because first of all, it's a very niche thing. Only a small number of people are going to want to run a restaurant. And it's made even smaller by the fact that there's nothing in the books that say, here's how to run a restaurant, right? If you had that, people would be more likely to look at that and go, oh, that's an option. Okay, here, I guess maybe I'll do that. But God, it comes down to the combat. And I've had so many conversations with so many people who say like, no, D&D is about story. D&D is all about it's about a collective story. We're telling a story together. Nah, you're playing a cooperative board game minus the board. But it's rooted in the system and the mechanics, and that means that it's ultimately rooted in the combat. And even it's hilarious to me when somebody says D&D is all about story, but then every story is about find these people and kill them, because and every story always comes down to like, how do I figure out a way to make it so that the players ultimately just have to kill this guy, and that's heroic, right? That's kind of the goal of like your standard BBG campaign. That's the point of that. And I don't know. I just get sick of people saying that that the game is that it's about story. It's not about story. If you want to tell a story, you need to understand the medium, and the medium that you're telling a story through is game. Game is the medium. You can tell a story through gameplay. Absolutely you can. Because if your players are undergoing tension and there's conflict and they're making decisions and driving events through those decisions, and the events are new tensions and new decisions that unfold, but the basic actions that they undertake are abstractly the same in like a loop, right? Like you find enemies, fight enemies, get loot, buy stuff, find enemies, fight in a loop. And I mean, that's not quite what D&D would be. But it's close. It's close, right? And if you're finding enemies or buying stuff, sometimes there's other stuff that comes in there that you need to make a check for. But ultimately, the game is about fighting, right? If you don't have a long-term goal, then people will generally will get bored of the fighting, because it's just sort of combat after combat after combat. Although some people will really enjoy that, but just because the goal is a narrative idea doesn't at all mean that the game is narrative, right? That's kind of insane, right? That's like that's just because the goal is find out who this person is doesn't mean that you're not telling that story through the medium of a game. It just means that the goal is that. And then the path to the goal is what defines what you're doing, and the medium is game. You can tell stories through gameplay. And I think one thing that's really important to understand with regard to combat is how to tell stories through gameplay. A little self-contained story, right? Like what is the central conflict, and what are the stakes of the story, and how do the players overcome those obstacles? That by creating a little self-contained story, you can tell that all the way through gameplay. And one thing that I do rather frequently when I'm running combat is I'm not a big believer in the idea that combat is made better through interesting descriptions. You can twinge player emotions. You can sort of spark player emotions, but the spark doesn't really catch fire. So it's only useful as feedback sometimes, but in general, it's not that useful. So like make the players feel cool. You can kind of do that with like narrative descriptions, but also that doesn't really fundamentally change the way they see things. It doesn't really mess with their headspace. It doesn't really put them in a different kind of frame of mind in order to make different decisions, which means that you can't take that and go, well, here's how I want things to play out after that. It's more about like, here's just a feeling in the moment that I want you to have. And you probably should have some of those, but those aren't really part of the craft, because it's incredibly easy to make those. In order to make somebody feel good immediately, you just have to compliment them. Like that you can just do that and you're pretty much set. That's all you need to do. Now the players feel good and they'll give you positive feedback at the end of the session. So if all you're looking for is positive feedback at the end of the session, then that's all you need to do. Make your players feel cool and heroic. And that's why people so often say, it's the rule of cool, or fun is the first and most important thing. D&D is about having fun, because these principles don't mean anything. As principles, they don't mean anything. They don't help you guide your thought process at all. And what that means is it doesn't help you if you're a DM who's interested in sort of the craftsmanship of DMing and of game design and and how it flows and works and how to use it as a craft to create interesting experiences, short and long term, then the idea of the rule of cool or D&D is about having fun should no longer be your primary concern. Doesn't mean throw it out entirely. It just means it's not your primary concern. It's pretty far down your list, in fact, probably. So you got to be careful. You got to make sure everything kind of like fits together in the way that you want it to, and you got to make sure that you're not falling into the trap of good positive player feedback, because it's really easy to get positive player feedback. So I don't really get feedback from my players on purpose, but I always look for specific signifiers. How do people respond to things? What do they remember? When they remember something, how do they talk about it? So, for example, I gave my players it was basically like a voiceover thing. I just recorded myself doing narration for a very short story that I'd written. That was the sort of backstory of one of the NPCs in the game, and then I basically never brought him up again. And that's really important, because when they eventually ended up in the town where that NPC has a shop, I said nothing. I very pointedly said nothing, because it was very important to me to know if they were going to bring him up, right? If they bring him up unprompted, then that tells me that they're thinking about the NPC, that they care about the NPC, that they want sort of more of that NPC. Because what'll happen is, if you bring up the NPC but they weren't going to bring up the NPC, they'll go, oh yeah, we really liked him, right? But they didn't really, because if they did, they probably would have remembered him. Now, that's not necessarily a binary decision, and it's not necessarily correct, but it's at least one indicator, and it's a pretty good indicator that your players care about that NPC, because they remember the NPC. So I didn't bring up the NPC at all. I just waited to see if they did, and they did. And then once they did, I started to incorporate the NPC more. I started to say yes a lot more to the stuff they wanted to do with that NPC, because first I wanted to be very sure that what they were doing was of their own volition, because that helps a lot. So I really wanted to do that. I'm gonna take some time, and I'm gonna answer some DM's Guild questions. Not DM's Guild. DM's, what's it called? I always forget the name of the subreddit. DM Academy. I don't know why I always forget the name of the subreddit, but I always do. But I'm just gonna read some of these, and I'm gonna sort by need advice. I'm just gonna read. No, I'm not. You know what? I'll do offering advice too. As a DM, are you fine with the explanation it's magic, or do you need more? He says, I do for everything. The answer to that question, I think, is really straightforward. It's you need exactly as much explanation as you need in order to make the players feel like there's more. The trick to a really big feeling world isn't to have a really big feeling world. The trick is to make it feel big, not for it to be big. So so here's an example of something you can do. If you do something like have a mystery. Oh, here's a great example. I just did this the other day. Not the other day, but a few sessions ago. I had my players encounter an NPC on the road. The NPC on the road told them all about this strange man who bought a bunch of maps from him. And they were all maps of a particular region. And the NPC was like, it's very weird. He paid a lot of money for these maps, and it's very weird that he's that interested in that region. And the region is very far away, and very much going there would very much get in the way of all of the other much more pressing matters that the players have. In another campaign, I gave them a portal to an unknown place. It looked to be ancient ruins that would have been a place to explore crazy lore stuff. And they just couldn't, because they were in the middle of something. And that was perfect. Like, that's great. See, that's a win-win situation, because if they go through the portal, I have them hooked on a plot thread that's going for probably a pretty long time, and that can sustain me for a while. And they just left a bunch of stuff behind. So now they have this other stuff that they left behind in mind, and that makes the world feel a lot bigger. Or they skip it. And I could have 0 things written for what that adventure actually is, what the area is, what the lore is, what the history is, but it doesn't matter, because I've implied that there's something there. So now the players always think there's something there, but will never know. They'll never know. This is like Half-Life 2 did this a long time ago. Half-Life has these the halls that like lead to a dead end. If you've heard of this, is the design. It's a pretty famous design example where there's like 2 hallways and one leads to a dead end and one doesn't. And sometimes you'll go down the hallway and find the dead end, but sometimes you'll go down the hallway and find that it's not a dead end, and you'll always wonder what was behind that other hallway. And sometimes you'll go down one hallway and see that there's a thing there, but then it goes to a dead end, like it's a little ammo pickup or something. And then it just makes the world, even though the level's completely linear, it makes it feel much more sprawling and much larger. So I'm not fine with the explanation it's magic. That's not good enough, because you need something to pique the player's interest. You should not resolve the player's curiosity all the time. In fact, I would argue that you should rarely solve the player's curiosity. No. What you want to do is you want to pique curiosity and then leave it unresolved. Because if they have 5, 6, 7, 8 things that you've piqued their curiosity about that have been left completely unresolved, then what the player thinks is like, oh my God, there's like this thing and 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 this thing all going on, and we don't know what any of that is. And you get to the point where it's too much for them to manage, so they start to lose things. They start to forget about stuff, which then when they remember it later, they're like, oh yeah, there was this that we never did and we never found out what this is. And that to me is really important. That's a really big component of the world building, because even though it's not really part of the world building, but it does do a lot to contribute to like making things feel big, making things feel expansive, making it feel real. It's an important component of verisimilitude, I think. And that helps a lot, because again, world building, the feeling of a big world, not world building, but the feeling of a big world that's big, wide, and open, has a bunch of stuff going on, again, comes down to game design. What decisions do the players make? Because if they make the decision to do thing A instead of thing B, they're always going to wonder what thing B was, but they decided not to do it, which means that it's always going to be in their minds. And the fact that it was an active decision fundamentally changes the way that feels, and it makes the world feel big. So that's that answer. You don't need every detail, but that's not the thing. The thing is, you need to make it feel big, and you need to separate the idea of being big versus feeling like a big world. Very different. Some of these are really silly questions. How to make a long-term interesting pursuit. The question is how to make long-term pursuit campaign compelling. He's a reasonably experienced DM trying to make his adventures more compelling and more fun. That's your first mistake. Here's the situation. One of my players has told me that as much as they love my world, characters, and side quests, they don't feel like they're advancing towards any larger goal. Okay. He says that's great feedback. Maybe. First thing is, you don't necessarily need them to be, again, you don't need them to be advancing toward a larger goal in order for them to feel like they're advancing toward a larger goal. If you make players do thing A, and then thing A leads to thing B, and then thing B leads to thing C, your players might just wonder where this trail is going, right? Think about it like a trail of breadcrumbs, but not one that you placed. You see a trail of breadcrumbs going off into the distance. You're like, where? You don't know where it's going. You don't even know if there is a destination. But you wonder, where is this trail of breadcrumbs taking me? And you're curious, and you'll follow it. Then the trick is, how can I make the players want to keep following the trail of breadcrumbs? Which means occasionally you have to give them something, but it doesn't mean you have to actually resolve their goal. In fact, the longer the player's ultimate goal remains unresolved, the better off you are, because when they've resolved their ultimate goal, the game ends. There's nothing left for them to do. So the game is over. So you need the goal to be, you need the players to have that goal for as long as possible, which means you can't have them accomplish the goal. That is anathema to the game existing. So you need to make sure that it's happening. So he's doing long-term pursuit campaign. Interesting. So the next couple of sessions, continuing, I'm going to have a mysterious and recently appeared villain kidnap a beloved child NPC and flee to a nearby island archipelago. The party will, hopefully, set sail to find the villain and save the child, which I think is a clear enough goal. Here's my question. What are some techniques I can use to make my players feel like they're getting closer to that goal every session? How can I keep the overarching story moving while still doing the part of DMing I'm good at, world building and lore? So, he's asking for techniques. And the problem here is I don't like posting these solutions because the solutions to these problems are always much deeper. Because it started with he wants to make his adventures more compelling, more fun. Well, that's not clear. Right? What is the emotional pursuit and what is the tension of the pursuit? Those are the questions that you need to be asking. And that does so much. Like, this is exactly the kind of problem that comes up when you only think in terms of like, D&D should be fun. I guess in a broad sense it should be. I mean, if it's not, then that's a problem. It also depends on how you define fun. But that's the whole problem, right? I don't care. It's all about those core definitions and the defining the player experience in a way that's useful to you. So tensions and player decisions. So here's an example, right? If you're doing a long-term pursuit campaign, I don't know exactly what that means, but I think basically the idea is I want my players to have a long-term goal that they're pursuing. Well, again, you don't necessarily have to have a long-term goal for them to feel like what they're doing is leading to somewhere. Now, the root of the question was more about how do I make the players feel like they're going somewhere? And that's easy. You just make things always connect. Now, I don't mean narratively, although you can absolutely do that too, probably should. But what I mean is if the players make this set of decisions, then that set of decisions should lead to another set of decisions, right? This set of decisions, therefore this set of decisions, therefore this set of decisions. And if you're doing that, and also providing feedback for all of those decisions, then eventually things are going to start to accumulate. And then you just have to figure out some sort of narrative context that contains those decisions that they've made into a single easily followed train of logic. That's all you need to do. It's actually very simple. The techniques, I don't know. Just always be thereforeing. Always be thinking about the therefore in terms of what the player decisions are. And a lot of it is just defining what are the player decisions. You don't even have to do this proactively. If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't know how to do that yet, then take some gameplay that's happened, some sessions that have gone by, and look through the sessions that you find were the most compelling from your perspective as the DM, and go, what were the player decisions that were made here? How can I frame those decisions? Right? Because then what you can do in the future is you can still work from intuition as a starting point. You can just go, I want to make this thing because it feels cool, but you just stop. You stop there. You don't go, I'm going to make it feel cool. Let's implement it. No. You stop and then look at it and go, okay, but what are the player decisions? Right? It's what the fuck is this? Hang on. Yeah. I got a weird notification, sorry. So lost my train of thought, but I think I was basically done. You don't want to take fun and then push it through. You want to stop and ask yourself what the decisions they would be making in that circumstance are. Because then you can start with an actual circumstance and go, what are the decisions? And then you'll come up with something, and then you compare those decisions with the circumstance and go, are those decisions actually present in this circumstance? If not, how can I change the circumstance so that they are? Right? There's like this conceptual iteration process that goes. How do you boat? No, that's the question. It's in all caps too, so it's not how do you boat, it's how do you boat? How you boat. I'm a really new DM and I've set my first campaign, which is homebrewed, as a nautical quest. By the way, as an aside, I really recommend that you start homebrewing. I know a lot of people recommend that you start with modules. Modules are trash. Don't use modules. Modules, I'm really perplexed by how popular modules are, but also how popular it is for people to complain about a campaign because it feels too video gamey. Like, a module is a video game. Everything is set in stone. anything, and if it's not, then the DM is making it up as they go anyway, and they might as well just do a homebrew thing. So anyway, I recommend that you start with homebrewing your own stuff, and it's going to be horrible. Like, it's going to be terrible for a while, and you just have to deal with that. But I think if you're really thinking about your process and how it unfolds and how it connects to things, and you start with a homebrew world and you just suffer through the bad for a while, you'll end up much better for it long term. Anyway, how do you boat? I'm a really new DM, and I've set my first campaign, which is homebrewed as a nautical quest. So that's another piece of advice that I would probably have is stick to the rule book. When in doubt, go with what the rules say. Because if you don't, and actually I shouldn't say when in doubt, I should say always stick with what the rules say. Because the chances are the designers who have put a bunch of thought, whose job it is to put these rules together, have a much clearer idea of how everything works together, and there are probably a bunch of pieces of the puzzle that you are just not aware of. And trying to make a new puzzle out of the 3 pieces that you take out of the box doesn't really work. So I would say stick to raw as much as possible. And then just allow players to do whatever, right? Give them all the books. Don't do UA, but give them whatever books. Just give them whatever books you like, really. Don't worry about, like, if you're not comfortable with design, then don't even try to do assessments. Just give the players the books, and then take out UA, take out anything you just don't like. Don't say I'm taking this out because it's too strong, because because it's a bad design. If you don't know how to assess design, like, that's not meaningful. Just say I don't like it. I've done this, by the way. I've absolutely done this. Not with rule books, but with players coming to me with character concepts. I'll just tell them I don't like it. I don't think it's bad, but I don't like it. And, like, I should like it. Just like if I'm doing world building and I give you world information, you should like it. You should like the world that I'm running. I should like your character. Because if I don't like your character, eventually I'm just gonna not do anything with it. Like, I'm gonna do as little with it as I possibly can get away with, and that's a disservice to everyone. So if I don't like the character concept, I'm just gonna say, like, I don't like your character concept. I wouldn't want to work with that. And the thing is, a player can always find a character that they're excited about playing. There's probably 100 character concepts that they could come up with that they'd be excited about playing. So the fact that you veto one because you don't like it personally is totally fine. Anyway, I spent a few sessions making my players earn the boat. It's a nautical campaign, but they have to earn the boat. So then it's right, because now you're saying, I'm going to run a nautical campaign, but I'm going to make you earn it. I'm going to do this thing that I want to do, but I'm going to make you earn the thing that I want you to do. So he's created a tension here that shouldn't exist. He's inadvertently, he's thinking about tension, right? This DM, hypothetical DM is, Lucky Refrigerator 7. That's his name. Like this Lucky Refrigerated 7 DM is thinking about tension. He's thinking about how to create tension, but he's just creating tension. He's not thinking about the nature of the tension or how that plays out. It's just, here's tension now. You got to get a boat. I've told you you got to get the boat. Okay, but you got to do the stuff to get the boat. You got to earn it. If you wanted to be a nautical campaign, give them a boat. Like, just start on a boat. Say you're a bunch of people who work on a boat. Okay, you're on a boat. Go. And if you don't want to do a nautical campaign, don't do a nautical campaign. I think this is a situation where I would say go all in or don't go all at all. I plan on them encountering an enemy ship pretty early on. Could really use some help with how it works, as my resources are super low currently. Nautical combat is, there is Salt Marsh, but nautical combat doesn't work that well in D&D. I don't want to answer that question specifically. You know what, I will. I will give a very brief answer to that specific question, which is make the boat basically function like a lair, give it lair actions, and then have the boats have lair actions that affect each other. That's how I would run it. Because then you're working within the confines of D&D as the rules already exist. You're working within pre-existing frameworks, which makes it a lot better. And also, it means that players can use their characters and their class abilities and stuff. If you shove a character on like, you have to man the cannons, that's kind of neat. Like a couple times because they get to shoot cannons and maybe even roll a lot of dice for damage. And whoa boy, but after they've shot the cannon 3 or 4 times, they start to realize that their turn is coming up a 4th time, and they go, all right, I guess I'm attack again. Right? There's not a lot of, you're really removing tension, removing interesting decision makings that's really well built into to class design already. So don't take away that. I would just say have the boat function as a lair action, based on lair action. It's a lair, give it lair actions, move on. But ultimately, like there are some errors. I guess not errors, but there's some ways to think about this that DM is thinking about things in a way that's not terribly effective. Campaign help. I'm running a game for 3 players set in a big city. First antagonists I've thrown at them are a cult of demon worshippers that occupy the tunnels under the city, which I'm thinking are actually remnants of another civilization. Oh. Hang on. We should do dramatic narration. I'm running a game for 3 players set in a big city. No, I already read that paragraph, so that's stupid. Anyway, their leader is a Furbolg druid whose tribe was wiped out in the past by an orc warband. He came into contact with the remnant of an Oboxob, now wants to bring the whole city to ruin, and his peaceful community of hobos are brainwashed and tortured into compliance. So that's all plot stuff. That's all just plot stuff. I just read 2 paragraphs of pure plot. None of it is relevant. He needs a good way to escalate the situation. Like something threatening the city to affect the city at large that isn't so catastrophic. I want the threat to ramp up. He's got a decent starting point, actually. The idea that he knows what he wants, he knows what he doesn't want. They're still very vague ideas, but this idea of like, I want to escalate the situation. He knows there needs to be tension. It's a good starting point. I mean, it's better than not knowing you need tension, although you don't get a lot of credit for it because most people recognize that much. He also realizes, however, that it shouldn't be catastrophic. He wants to keep the city intact. That's all fine. The only thing is, I would say, this is a very plot-driven way of thinking, and plot-driven thinking doesn't tend to make good D&D games. Because plot is going to come down to, do your players think the plot is cool? And then it comes down to like that moment of, oh, that was neat. That was neat. And that was cool. And that's the end of it. Just like I was talking about earlier with like the if you give a player a compliment, they feel good in the moment. That's kind of how I feel about plot. It's just there to give them something to latch onto so that everything makes kind of contextual sense, so that it's concrete. So the things that happen, the events that occur are concrete, and the decisions can be contextualized so that you can create the tensions you want to create. Let's see. A lot of these I don't think are very good questions. Ooh, here's one. Need help with balancing. This is going to be good. So I'm planning on making a one-shot in which the final boss will be a level 20 character, a monk. I will have 4 players in this one-shot, so what level should I make them in order to make the final fight tough, yet possible? Balance. This is a great circumstance. As soon as I read the title of this, Need Help with Balancing, I knew it was going to be this. And that's why I was excited, so I clicked on it. Because balance is like so not the way to think about D&D design. It's just absolutely not. If you're thinking about what tensions and decisions are need to unfold, then balance just kind of happens by default, because if you're not creating those tensions, then the problem is that those tensions need to be created. You need to resolve whatever's keeping those tensions from unfolding in gameplay. So sometimes that might be something like, I'm a fighter and I do a lot of damage and I can one-shot every monster. Therefore, you can't create tension in combat. And if you make the enemies stronger, then there's no tension for any of the other players because they can't affect combat at all. But now there's tension for the fighter. You could call that a balance problem. But balance isn't a goal, right? That's the problem is people think of balance as like the goal. Balance is not a goal. If you're thinking about balance as sort of like the result that you're after, stop doing that. You need to be thinking about it like if you look at the combat curve series, never once do I talk about balance. I always only talk about like you want to spike in intensity, then you here for these reasons. And then if you do the spikes in intensity here and the dips in intensity here, you create this kind of overall player experience. And if you create a spike where the spike murders the whole party in one shot, you can't dip the intensity and spike it again. Like you can't continue that curve, right? The problem is you've removed the ability to create the gameplay experience. Balance is so not relevant. So really, the answer that I would give this post is my D&D curves, my combat curve series will help you out a lot. I bring that up a lot, but it's a good framework. I recommend it. I use it. I mean, I actually use that framework. Like I've watched my own videos on that because I don't remember. I make custom curves. I don't use those 5 curves all the time. In fact, I usually don't, except maybe the mini boss curve, which is a very standard sort of D&D encounter curve. But I do use curve, like the principle of combat curves I use constantly. Almost every combat that I design is based on those curves. I have a lot of success with them. I highly recommend using them. These are some strange posts. Is this homebrew monster too powerful for level 12 players? Those questions are not useful. I don't recommend thinking about things in terms of balance. All right, I think that's enough. I think that's enough for today. Rogue, not Rouge. Rogue, not Rouge. There's a post offering advice. Rogue, not Rouge. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to upvote that. Yeah, upvote that. Okay. Here's one. I'll do one more. Okay. You don't notice anything interesting is the title of the post, and it's offering advice. I frequently see people complaining about PCs getting obsessed about some innocuous object just because the DM decided to add a little flavor to their description of the surroundings. When the PCs ask questions about it for over an hour, what happens if I try to twist it? No, pull it. Blast it with force damage, radiant damage. Ask it politely in Sylvan. What about threatening it in Draconic? Have we tried an interpretive dance? Meanwhile, the DM is slowly slamming their head against the table, repeating over and over, "It's just a chair, please, can we move on?" Enter one of the most important phrases in my DM toolkit. You don't notice anything interesting. This is a phrase I use to signal to my players that there's nothing secret about this door, wall, chair, or whatever. It tells them that they don't need to try 17 other triggers. I think the players know this. I've told them about this phrase ahead of time and I use it often enough. I'm skimming now. So when I say that this chair is interesting, I know that it's time to move on. The solution provides a bunch of benefits. Yeah, I mean, whatever. Here's the thing. I actually don't necessarily agree with this all the way. It's fine, and I've done that before, where players start to get a little bit sidetracked on a bunch of stuff, and I'll just say, yeah, it looks like you're probably not going to find it. It really does look like you're probably not going to find anything interesting here, and that's fine. I've also communicated to my players about in-game things completely out of game, like DM to player. I'm communicating something, this goes into a general rule of thumb that I like to follow, which is the players are incompetent, but the characters are highly competent. And I know that sounds like it sounds derisive, but it's really not, because the reason players are selectively incompetent, and because it's so common for players to appear incompetent, is because they're dealing with an extremely limited amount of information, right? Like, we think of D&D as you describe the environment and you can do whatever you want, but you can't really, because you can only work with the information you have. And because you only have description, and sometimes maybe like a reference image or something, but generally speaking, the main thing is description, you are dealing with an extraordinarily small amount of information. So I don't like to use lighting on maps. And one of the main reasons I don't like to use lighting on maps is because navigating a black space on a map where your vision is limited to like 5 feet or whatever, assuming you don't have dark vision, on a 2D map and just moving a token around a 2D map is pure trial and error, because you just see black space and you have no context or understanding of anything that could possibly be. But if you were a person in that space, you have things like proprioception, you have things like spatial awareness, right? These even things like feel, where you can maybe feel like a breeze coming from a certain direction, or put your hands along a wall and follow it. There are methods to make your way through a space. So by putting the players on a map like that, what you've done is you've maximized the disconnect between player decisions and character decisions. Because now player decisions are, I'm going to randomly poke around this map until I find not black space. And the player, the character would be more like, I need to try to navigate the space, which is a set of navigation challenges and perception challenges. Not perception like the skill check, but like general awareness. And I think this comes down to a very similar thing of just like understanding that your players are and when I say they're incompetent, it's not really that they're incompetent, it's that they're working off of an extremely limited set of information. And I think part of your job as a DM is to interpret what they do for them. So you don't take what they do at their word all the time. You interpret what they're trying to accomplish. You try to interpret what they're trying to accomplish and assume that the player is going to be competent. And so there are times when my players will say, I want to do this. And I, as the DM, will tell them as a player, not like in character, here's an NPC that tells you your character a thing, but like I'm telling you, DM to player, that doesn't make any sense, right? Because what that means is if it's something that I think makes no sense, then there's been some miscommunication, which is not a failing on anyone's part, because it's just 100% inevitable. It's going to happen. It's 100% going to be a thing. That the second you start talking about anything, you have a picture in your head, and then you start talking about it, and there's miscommunication. It happens immediately and inevitably 100% of the time. There's nothing you can do about it. But you can mitigate the effects of it by interpreting, right? So here's a great example. One time I had a group of enemies that was outside, and the players were in a building hiding away from them. And then my players said, one of my players said, I'm going to cast invisibility to get advantage on the stealth check, because I was asking for a stealth check. And I could have said, okay, you cast invisibility, make your stealth checks. And then they go, I get to make it with advantage. And then I can say, no, you don't. And they go, what do you mean? Because it's invisibility. It makes you invisible. They're outside listening for you. Sight doesn't factor into this equation. And it would have been a completely reasonable decision in the moment. But by pushing that back a little bit and trying to listen, like this is to me, like the skill of listening as a DM is trying to interpret what your player is trying to do. So when the player says, I want to cast invisibility, I don't say, okay, you cast invisibility, and then tell them it doesn't do anything. I say, so that you might as well save your spell slots, right? Because it's just like you can't see them. There's no windows or anything. They can't see you. It wouldn't do anything. And that's me talking to the player. That's me, the DM, talking to the player, saying it wouldn't accomplish anything. But it's very similar to what this kind of Reddit post is saying, where it's like I tell the players, you signal to the players like you probably don't find anything interesting. And I think it's totally fine to kind of break character, because being a DM is kind of being in character in a way where you sort of adopt, you as part of the social contract. But I find that it's very useful to just break character and say, don't do that. Just the other day, I had a player who was trying to like constantly use healing potions on a downed player. And I was like, you should probably just fight it. You're a ranger. And the idea was that player is supposed to be like the DPS of the party, probably the main DPS of the party, at least a large portion of their damage. And you're like trying to use potions, and like based on the fact that your initial goal was to build kind of this DPS, like the damage output, the DPR character, and the fact that you're currently sort of like frazzled because the fight's particularly difficult because there's a lot going on, and you get kind of like thrown off your game, and you're not really thinking, and you're panic mode, potions, and it's like you should just fight it, right? Just shoot it. So like things like that are I think perfectly acceptable. I think because it's one of those things where, like, given the circumstance, I would think that this character would have, you know, combat experience and probably be a lot cooler under pressure than the player is. And there's been some disconnect, some miscommunication, and things have gone off course a little bit. Like, it would be I think it should be a very uncontroversial and not shocking at all to say that while I am a very good DM, I make mistakes, and sometimes I don't catch those mistakes right away. So they kind of veer off. And one thing that I had sort of failed to account for was that this player in particular is sort of easily rattled. It's easy to sort of put them in panic mode. And I had failed to account for the possibility that would occur and how that would change the decisions, how that would change the way that the decisions sort of unfold. So the way I corrected that was, hey, don't worry about it. You should just shoot it. It's fine. So I'm all on board with this, but I think you can go this idea of, like, you know, tell your players there's nothing. This idea of, like, tell your players there's nothing interesting. Absolutely. Yeah, do that. So, but also I think you can take it much further, right? And I think it actually comes down to something much more fundamental, much deeper, which is presume your player's competence. And then you have to, like, do some of the work to interpret their actions for them. Never tell them what they do or how they feel. Never tell your player how their character feels or what their character does. Never do that. But always check, right? Are you sure you want to do that because XYZ? Because you could do this instead. And that, like, this is something that I do occasionally, right? Where I say, like, it really seems to me that your character in this situation would probably do something more like this. Would you rather do that? And if they say no, that's the end of it. Like, I don't bring it up again. I go, okay, then you do this other thing. The initial thing that we're going to do. But very frequently, because I make a point of understanding the characters really well, and usually probably close to 80-ish% of the time, the thing that I recommend is they go, yeah, actually that does make more sense. So I have this ability to kind of, like, break character and go, you know, here's sort of how I would see this playing out for you. And there is a bit of a weirdness to that, because when the DM says, here's what I would kind of recommend, players are more likely to accept that, because it's almost like you're giving them permission to do something. But my players, I think, at this point understand that if I'm sort of breaking character and saying, here's how I think this would go, generally speaking, that doesn't mean that action has no consequences. And I'll usually make that clear, right? Like, I'll say, it seems to me that your character would probably do something more like this. Just be aware that these things would probably happen as a result. And tell them the things that I think that they would be perfectly capable of figuring out on their own, so that then they have the opportunity to make that decision. It's really simple, really straightforward, but I think that idea of, like, presuming the character's competence is really important, because players are going to be incompetent in ways that the characters aren't, because of how limited the information that they have is. All right. That was good. My voice is getting tired, but, you know, we got an hour in. This is interesting. I am really interested to see how people like this. I'm really, like, and this is like a podcast. Like, I'm really excited, kind of. It's probably going to do terribly. Like, this video is probably going to be awful, but I like just, like, talking. I enjoy this idea of just, like, getting some ideas in my head and just kind of working them out. I have a little bit of an issue with the YouTube videos and making them cleaner, because I use these like, sit down and figure this stuff out is sort of what I want to do. I don't usually go into it with, like, a fully formed idea. I usually, the videos that are the best have usually had 2 or 3 recordings. You know, the last one that I did, that was the first. I did multiple takes and had to do some editing and cut some stuff, but it was just like, it was my first. I sat down, recorded it, then I edited it and sent it out, and it was a little bit rambly. There's a lot of, like, working through the ideas, figuring out which idea I really wanted to, like, hold on to, and what the idea really was, sort of solidifying it, how I wanted to talk about it. Articulation, you know, 90% of the skill of articulation is understanding. So I just didn't have a strong understanding of what I wanted to talk about. So it ended up talking about like a couple different things, and then they were went a little bit haywire. So I like this format because I can sit down and just sort of like work through something. Let me know if you want more of that. And also if you post questions in the comments, I will just answer them in a video. If you don't like this, that's fine. I think what I'll probably do is if I can, what I'd like to do is do like one of these and then one of the kinds of videos that I've been making every week. Going to like a sort of 2 video a week thing where this is just unfiltered, half an hour to an hour of just me talking about a thing whenever the mood strikes me. All right. Like, comment, and subscribe, all that stuff. Thanks for listening. If you made it this far in, hey, you are very smart and attractive. Good job. Good job on that. All right. I'll see you guys next week. Please let me know how you like this video. It was very different. More of a podcast, really. Okay. Bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye. Goodbye. 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 Oh. Never mind. I'll get you later. Bye.